Hello and welcome to the Blenderized Pediatric Formula Overview video, Category B41-49, Part 1. This video series is broken into two parts. Part 1 will look at the history of enteral formulas and define the term blenderized in reference to tube feeding formulas. And Part 2 will review the 6 currently marketed as blenderized products that are available. We'll discuss each formula's claim, look at their ingredients, and I'll provide some pediatric clinical examples of each of these products in use. So who's the dietitian and what gives me license to talk about these formulas? My name is Christina Crowder Anderson. I'm a registered pediatric dietitian nutritionist, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified nutrition support clinician. I completed my internship at Duke University Hospital and then moved on to the University of Oklahoma in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I worked at their pediatric endocrinology and gastroenterology clinics. It's there that I fell in love with blenderized formulas or blenderized diets. I had been trained to use standardized tube feeding formulas, so all the way from a polymeric intact protein formula to a hydrolyzed formula, then to an elemental formula. And those three formulas were really the only option to go back and forth between when a child was not tolerating their tube feedings. It was at the University of Oklahoma Harold Hamm Diabetes Center that I was introduced to blenderized diets and saw firsthand the ability and the mechanism behind them in improving gagging and retching and constipation in so many children that were really struggling to tolerate their tube feeds. It's from there that I moved to Oklahoma City and I worked in the neonatal ICU at the Children's Hospital and their pediatric medical and surgical floors, where I continued to take care of children that had feeding tubes, that were on parenteral nutrition, that had complex GI surgeries and GI conditions. At the beginning of 2020, my husband and I moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I've opened a pediatric-focused private practice that uses evidence-based nutrition and specializes in infant and child tube feeding with blenderized diet expertise. So what is a blenderized tube feeding formula? A blenderized formula or blenderized diet is a mixture of whole foods or purees that are then blended to create a liquid that can be bolused via feeding tube. These formulas tend to have a thicker consistency than standard enteral formulas and need to be thinned with additional liquid to be run through a feeding pump. Some families will blend their actual meals and use these as formula, and others will use recipes provided by their healthcare team or mix whole foods plus commercial standard products to create a blend appropriate for their child. Additional liquid is going to be needed for hydration, but it's usually given separately because part of the effective aspect of the blenderized diet is its thickness and the ability of that to help decrease gagging and retching. All enteral formulas should follow pediatric or adult nutrition guidelines. At this point, formulas use the Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Range, or the AMDR, which suggests what percent of total calories each macronutrient should comprise. Macronutrients are carbohydrates, protein, and fat, but they don't specify the food sources like the current USDA guidelines, which suggest how many servings of lean proteins, fruits, vegetables, starches, and healthy fats should be included in the diet per day. The USDA guidelines also recommend limiting added sugars to less than 10% of the diet per day, which is something that until recent years has not been considered with enteral formulas. Most standard enteral formulas are about 50% carbohydrate, and that carbohydrate is derived from sugar. It either uses corn syrup solids, corn maltodextrin, or these days the more trendy brown rice syrup, which is really just sugar by any other name. Vitamins and minerals are added as needed. These should be customized to the patient with preference to food sources because we know that vitamins and minerals are better absorbed from the food source within which they're found versus synthetic vitamins and minerals. Vitamins and minerals are also not regulated by the FDA, so unless they're third-party tested, you don't really know what's in the product, and special care should be taken when given to anyone, either adult or child. The blended formulas are typically fed via gastrostomy tube, as there's minimal research exploring the use of blended foods being administered directly into the jejunum, and healthcare professionals question absorption as this part of the intestine is beyond the duodenum, which is the site for absorption of major minerals like copper and selenium. This doesn't mean that you can't infuse a blended formula via the jejunum or J-tube. There definitely are families who do this, but it needs to be highly individualized, and you need to work with your healthcare team and your dietitian to make sure that you yourself or your child is absorbing the nutrition that's being fed through the jejunum for these kinds of formulas. And I want to note that if your child is on a standard formula like Pediatric or Nutri Junior, that it's not wrong. So first and foremost, fed is best, and that's something that we can all agree on. But we should consider the long-term ramifications of feeding a liquid medical food that's comprised primarily of sugar, vegetable oils, and some derivative of whey protein or something cheaper like soy or pea, versus administering a varied, balanced diet of real food. We really don't have long-term research on the effects of these formulas that use sugar, vegetable oil, and protein powder as sole source of nutrition for long term, but we do know that a varied, healthy diet of real food does contribute to improved health outcomes. Like all formulas, they should be monitored by a dietitian and with the medical doctor, especially for children who have special healthcare needs or are medically fragile, as they are not able to regulate their own appetite or thirst. When we look at the history of enteral formula, we really see that there's nothing new under the sun. So in 3000 BC, the first tube feeds were used with a mixture of wine, milk, whey, broth, and it was fed rectally. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th century, things got a little bit more sophisticated, and these formula mixtures were fed orogastrically, meaning from the mouth to the stomach, and were used with mixtures of jellies, beaten eggs, sugar, milk, and wine. We then look at the 1960s to 70s, which is where we saw the introduction of commercial standardized formulas. And then here we are present, 21st century, and the interest in holistic formulas and approaches has come back around, and a lot more families and parents and clinicians are looking at putting, quote, real food or food that all of us eat through a feeding tube instead of what was commercialized as, quote, enteral formula made from whey protein, vegetable oils, and some sort of sugar source, typically corn syrup solids and corn maltodextrin. I wanted to take a moment to look at enteral formula regulation. This really is important to understand how formulas get to market, what their labels say, what their ingredients say, and, is this legitimate or not? So infant formulas were regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, in the 1980s. In fact, in 1979, 2 different infant formulas were designed to be too low in sodium chloride and caused multiple cases of failure to thrive, which was associated with electrolyte abnormalities, specifically metabolic alkalosis, which was attributed to the formula. This incident caused Congress to pass the Infant Formula Act of 1980. In addition, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, or the FAO, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, put together the Codex Alimentarius Commission, which helped to develop food standards, guidelines, and related text for purchasing consumer health and ensuring fair trade practices globally. So in 1981, the Codex standard on infant formula was adopted based on the scientific knowledge available from the 1970s. Obviously, since then, it has been updated. Enteral formulas are not regulated because they are considered a, quote, medical food. And medical foods have been defined, but they're not regulated as conventional food or drugs. In fact, they're essentially without regulation other than those that apply to good manufacturing practices for conventional foods. These practices require vendors to ensure clean manufacturing facilities, inclusion of required ingredients, and provision of appropriate concentrations of ingredients in processed foods. And the vendors also fall under food safety regulations that ensure the sterility of these processed foods. But they're exempt from the regulations on labeling, which includes nutrition facts, and also legitimizing health claims that apply to conventional foods, as well as regulations that apply to drugs. So in a nutshell, enteral formulas can make structure and function claims without prior FDA approval or review. So a structure and function claim does several things. It can, 1, describe the relationship between a nutrient deficiency and a disease. It can describe the effect of a nutrient or dietary ingredient on a structure or function in humans, or it can describe how the dietary ingredient maintains structure or function. These claims are focused on the maintenance of a healthy metabolic function, not preventing disease, and the manufacturer is responsible for ensuring the accuracy and truthfulness of the claims, but they're not evaluated or approved by the FDA. So examples of these claims would include, quote, drinking milk builds strong bones, calcium builds strong bones, or saying that fiber maintains bowel regularity. Furthermore, there's a lack of prospective randomized controlled clinical trials supporting a lot of the purported indications on the majority of the specialty formulas that are on the market. So there just has not been enough research to substantiate the claims that the products are making, but because these formulas are considered medical foods, they're allowed to make these claims on their label and, essentially get away from it. So the other thing about tube feeding formulas is this has traditionally been viewed as a very, quote, sterile method of feeding the gut. We've been made to think that these standardized formulas are the only and the best option for tube-fed people. So somehow we go from, a healthy person eating a wide, varied diet, all the food, and then something happens to them, they need a feeding tube, and all of a sudden the same food they used to eat is no longer appropriate for them, and they have to be fed this thin liquid mixture of whey protein, vegetable oils, and sugar. So sterile is not necessary for 99% of individuals, and I would argue most individuals, unless they have a serious GI condition, could tolerate the same foods they used to eat by mouth, when really the reason they have the feeding tube is because there is a barrier getting that food from the mouth to the stomach. In part 2 of the video series, we're going to explore the 6 blenderized marketed pediatric tube feeding products, which include Real Food Blends, Functional Formularies Nourish, Nestle's Complete Pediatric Organic Blend, Nestle's Liquid Complete Pediatric Formula, Abbott's Pediasure Harvest, and Kate Farms Standard Pediatric 1.2 formula. This concludes the video today. If you have any questions or you're looking for more resources, I would love to chat. There's a link in the show notes below where you can contact me on my website at www.christinaandersonrdian.com. Just a friendly reminder that this webinar is not intended as professional medical advice. Please consult with your medical team prior to making any changes to your diet, and all views expressed are my own. Thank you.